All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I should give it a second to restart. Okay. Okay, now we're recording. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm really excited to have Tom presenting our second online study session. This is now officially being recorded, and it will be posted to the Troth's YouTube channel. So, Tom, take it away, and I'm going to mute everyone else. So remember to unmute yourself if you have a question or wish to talk.
Okay, so I'm Tom, and I'm currently the provost of the Troth Lore program. And I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about Viga-Glum saga, which it's one of the more obscure sagas. There aren't, readily available translations in English. As part of the Penguin series, there's some other translations around. And people don't usually talk about it when they talk about the Icelandic sagas. They usually spend most of their energy on Egil Saga or Njál Saga or some of the other ones. But I think it's a very interesting saga and one that's really quite relevant to heathens today, and particularly to people who are connected to Odin in one way or another. Viga-Glum saga is basically about, there we go. It's basically about a guy named Glúm, and he inherits from his grandfather these Odinic items, a cloak, a spear, a sword, and he rises up in the politics of his local fjord through kind of violence and legal chicanery and just kind of general ruthlessness. And he takes the place over. It's basically the people who live there are mostly Frey worshippers, it looks like, including his family. But he sort of displaces them and achieves a kind of a brief ascendancy as the leading guy in the district before he messes up and gets kicked out of power and is sent off to live somewhere else. And there are a bunch of things in this that are very interesting for heathens. One of them is you see the example of a guy who is pretty clearly dedicated to Odin, and a rivalry between the Odin cult and the Frey cult. Another thing that's very interesting about it is from a heathen metaphysical perspective, we often ask about luck and oaths and guardian spirits and patron gods and how all that stuff is supposed to work. And Viga-Glum gives a very interesting couple of set pieces that we can talk about to feed our arguments on one side or the other. And I think it's also interesting, you can ask, what makes a good leader or chieftain? And is an Odin guy really the guy you want to have lead you, or is it kind of a Frey-like leader? And I first found out about this saga, actually, I was driving around the ring road in Iceland in 2007. I'd always liked the Icelandic sagas. When I got out of school, I decided I'd go on vacation there. And so we're riding around on this bus around the ring road, and one of the places we stopped, it's got this little, highway roadside plaque that says, "This is where Viga-Glum saga was." And I was like, who's Viga-Glum? Never heard of him. So when I got back home, I read his saga, and I was just getting into heathenry at the time, and he looked very relevant because of my interest in Odin. So that's how I got into Viga-Glum saga, and it sparked a bunch of questions for me that I'm still sort of trying to puzzle through about these different questions. So let's see. Oh, you've all turned off your sound. But I was going to ask, how many of you guys have read the saga before we did this?
I read about half of it. It was kind of tedious for me. It was a little difficult. Yeah. It was a difficult translation. So I got about halfway through it, and I'm going to try to keep pushing through, Tom. But maybe after this, I'll be even more inspired.
Okay, well, it sounds to me like then I should give the summary section. If everybody was real familiar with it, I'd just skip the summary. Okay, so the saga itself, it's one of the Icelandic family sagas. They're different groups of sagas. They're the family sagas. They're the legendary sagas. They're the king sagas. They're the bishop sagas. The one that people usually think of when they say the Icelandic sagas are the family sagas. And they usually talk about locally important and famous people from different parts of Iceland in the period that basically goes from the settlement up to a little bit after the conversion period, really. So the kind of the founding figures, in some ways, of Iceland, or the next generation or the generation after that, really. And like all of these, most of these sagas, they're written after the conversion. The sagas are generally written in the 13th and 14th centuries, I think. And the conversion happened around the year 1000. So they're, about as far from the conversion date as we are from, I don't know, George Washington or something. Maybe a little bit farther. So they are looking back, and although they may be based on some kind of oral memory or tradition or earlier writings, they've definitely been massaged and edited and turned into stories. So you can't look at these as a completely transparent view of Viking Age Iceland. I tend to think of them almost as a kind of a big science fiction shared universe that the medieval Icelanders had, looking back on their past and trying to imagine what their past was. In some ways, the sagas, it seems to me, are really a kind of an act of imaginative reconstruction from this later medieval period. Viga-Glum saga is up here in this little purple dewey here. Do you see the cursor or not? Which is, my Icelandic and Old Norse are terrible, so I'm going to pronounce everything wrong, but they're up here in Eyjafjörður, which is one of the fjords up on the northern part of Iceland. And like all of the Icelandic family sagas, it is indeed kind of hard to read. They are not easygoing for a modern English-speaking audience, although they're actually a lot easier than most forms of medieval literature. If you've ever read Chrétien de Troyes or something like that, they're much more like a modern novel than most medieval literature and fiction is. But there are enough sort of stylistic differences that it can throw you off your groove. One of them is they almost always start not with the hero, but with the hero's ancestor who does things and sets up the rest of the story. And they have these very complicated family trees that are usually, these sagas are about various kinds of feuding. So remembering who's related to who and how and why they don't like each other is a bit of a problem. What I find is that there's usually one paragraph as a new section of the story opens that will explain the relationship between all of the major characters who are going to show up for the next couple of chapters. I call it the paragraph name dump, and I usually just bookmark that and go back to the name dump paragraph whenever I get confused. Also, if you just kind of keep reading and go with the flow, what I find is sometimes it doesn't even really matter how many of these guys' names you remember too well the first time through. Usually they get killed or leave anyway. But that's some hits for reading the sagas. The translation that's most readily available is from 1866. And if it's hard to read, that's because it was translated about the time of the American Civil War. But it is public domain, and so you can go and download it. It's fairly serviceable. I wouldn't use it for anything too serious, but it's free. There are a couple of other newer translations, which I don't actually have. Hollander did one in the 70s. There's another one from the 90s. There's also Terville Petre. Does he pronounce his name like it's French or what? Who did a lot of work in the sort of mid-century on Icelandic stuff. Did a teaching edition, essentially, of Viga-Glum saga with an Old Norse text and commentary and what do I want to say? Dictionary at the end of all the words that are found in it. So it was designed for people in the university who are learning Old Norse to read something in Old Norse. So you can find that helpful. And I got both of those over at hand here if we ever need to refer to them when we start discussing. So Viga-Glum's saga starts with his father, like they usually do. And he goes over to Norway with a friend who's a merchant. And like most of the saga heroes, the hero goes over to Norway where he at first doesn't look like he's anything special. There's a whole trope of this called the coal biter trope. But once he gets over there, something happens and he proves that he's an awesome, heroic dude and wins fame and fortune. And Viga-Glum's father does exactly the same thing. And he ends up marrying the daughter of Vigfus, who's a Norwegian chieftain, and a big deal over there. And they move back to Iceland and move on to his family land, and they have some kids, and one of them is Viga-Glum. Or I guess I should just call him Glúm. Viga is a word that means basically killer or murderer, which should give you some indication of his character. But after Glum's father dies, he and his mother are basically sort of, I don't know what I want to say, picked at or pushed on by the neighboring farms, and the people there are all related to them. But they're basically trying to take the good land away from this woman and her underage son, essentially. And the local cult is dedicated to Frey. There's a Frey temple. And one of the objects that they're fighting over, one of the things that the other members of the family are trying to grab away, is a field called Suregiver. I forget the actual Icelandic term. But most scholars who read this interpret Suregiver as being a kind of a sacred field to Frey, and its perpetually fertile aspect is part of the sort of Frey blessings. One of the things about this saga that's quite interesting is that there seem to have been older versions of the story that were more overtly supernatural, and that those have been sort of suppressed or euhemerized or made more naturalistic than what was probably the original version. So you kind of have to read between the lines to look for the supernatural elements, although they do seem to be there. And in some ways it almost is more interesting that the supernatural is kind of hiding behind the natural, that everything has a natural or human cause, but you can kind of see the divine elements or the supernatural elements playing underneath the surface where you can't quite get a handle on them. Anyway, Glúm grows up and he does the whole youth traveling abroad motif too. He goes over to Norway where he meets his grandfather and he does some heroic stuff and he wins his grandfather's approval. And then he goes back to Iceland. And many of the scholars who read this think that Glúm is seen as having become an Odinsman at this point. Because his grandfather gives Glúm 3 objects: a cloak, a sword, and a spear. And basically he says Glúm will do well as long as he keeps these objects. And it's a black cloak and a spear. And, you know, they certainly look an awful lot like you-know-who. So the scholars go back and forth about how Odinic they actually are, but it seems to me pretty clear. And then after he's back for a little while, he has a vision or a dream of a gigantic woman coming over the sea towards his farmstead, and he welcomes her into the house. And this is the sort of locus classicus where the Haminja as a family spirit or family luck, the best place where that idea shows up. And so when you read in heathen publications about the idea of a family luck or a clan spirit or family spirit, this is the text that they're going to usually for this. And he also realizes that his grandfather is dead. So the usual interpretation is that this is the guardian spirit of his family, his mother's family, that goes and basically is now residing with him. So Glúm begins to get power in the district. One of the first things he does is he kills the relative who took over this sugar field, and he kills him in the field, which is potentially, if this is a dedicated field to Frey, kind of a big act of sacrilege. And he does other things. He does various legal shenanigans and sort of targeted violence and rises up in power. I'm not going to go into all the details at the moment. But in this early part of the saga, one of his early opponents, a guy named Thorkel, is very close to Frey, and he takes one of his bulls to Frey's temple and asks that Frey is going to drive Glúm out of the district because Thorkel knows that he's going to have to leave, and he wants to get in some revenge or justice or whatever. And the bull falls over dead spontaneously, I think, showing that Frey accepted the sacrifice. And then he goes out and leaves the saga. But it sets up the idea that there's this rivalry, basically, between Frey and Glúm. So the saga goes on, and there are a number of different incidents that we can talk about later if you want to. But his downfall really kind of starts when he's pursued this series of killings. And one of the ways he tries to get out of it legally, the legal consequences, is he goes to the temple and he swears an oath that the people take as meaning that he did not kill these people and he wasn't there. And this part of the saga is more or less completely untranslatable. It only works in Icelandic, which is maybe one reason why this saga is not more popular. But he uses an obscure form of something or another that sounds like he's saying, I did not kill him there. But he's actually swearing, I did kill him there. And nobody really notices this because it's weird and poetic and just sort of sounds like what they expected him to swear. And he also, around this part of the saga, he gives away his magic objects that are supposed to keep his fortune safe. And at this point, he's found out. Somebody says, well, what exactly words did he use in that oath? And they're like, well, he said such and such. He says, that's weird. I've never heard anyone swear they did make the killing. And so they realize the game is up, and basically all of the rivalries and forces that he's sort of been kicking off over the course of the whole saga get together and force a legal judgment against him that forces him to go into exile. And he sees a vision of his ancestors pleading with Frey, who's sitting in, I think he's sitting in a big chair and all the people are around him. And they say, we're asking Frey to go easy on you, but he's not listening because he remembers that bull sacrifice. And Glúm does indeed fall from power. He's driven out of his ancestral holding, and he goes off and lives in some other part of Iceland where he basically becomes bitter and cranky, and he kind of plots to get his power back, but he never actually does it, and then eventually dies. The end. So, okay, that's the story of Glúm. Any questions at this point? We want to pause for a minute, see if anybody has anything they want to say? Okay. So the big question here is, how do we interpret this saga, or how should we interpret this saga? And, you know, there are a couple things, I think, in this saga that have a lot of relevance to modern-day heathenry. One of the things you can look at is, does it demonstrate a particular view on, I don't know what you would call it, heathen metaphysics, particularly things like oaths and how they work and what happens when you break them, luck, and people being close to certain gods. You can also ask the question, if you want to be a heathen leader, which I'm pretty sure most people don't, but if you do, or if you're looking for one, are the traits that Glúm exhibits as this saga goes on, is he a good leader, or is he a bad leader for this. I mean, in some ways, Glúm is kind of a jerk, but he does reward his followers. He secures his power. And in so many ways, he's a very good chieftain, but he kind of pushes too far and the whole thing falls apart. So what does that mean in terms of political models and models of behavior for leaders? And the part that interests me, because I'm closest to Odin, is what does this really mean for people who are dedicated to Odin or who are close to Odin? Are these exemplary traits in the sense that somebody like Viga-Glum is somebody we're supposed to act like, you know, WWVGD? Or is it a negative example? These are the mistakes Viga-Glum made and you should avoid these, or what? And I guess really the crux of the saga is how do you interpret his failure as a chieftain? The sort of the critical moment where he makes the false oath, he gives away his magic items. What is the lesson, if any, in that that downfall section? I guess first of all, I gotta have to question some of the presuppositions I've made here. There's nowhere in the saga that Glúm just says, I worship Odin. In fact, I don't even think Odin's name gets mentioned in the entire course of the saga. And there is, in fact, one section of the saga where he is asked, what does he believe in? And I think he gives the stereotypical, I believe in myself and my axe answer, which is another saga motif. So when he's asked, he basically says he's a kind of an atheist. But again, this is a saga that probably has revision layers in it. And reading this as somebody who's been in heathenry for a while, has read a lot of stuff, the things about him that are Odin-like are just, I don't see how anybody can not make the connection. He's got this magic dark cloak. He's got a spear. He has a kind of a quick temper. He kills people. I mean, that's in his name, for pity's sake. At one point, they talk about how he likes to laugh, right, when he decides he's going to kill somebody. And he uses clever words and deceptions and sort of trickery and chicanery to advance himself. And that's good enough for me, basically. But you should be aware that there's this counter-argument that denies his connection to Odin in some of the interpretations. The other thing that's going on in here is the rivalry between Odin and Frey, or Odin worshippers and Frey worshippers. And this is a motif that shows up in other family sagas. Athel Steinson's A Piece of Horse Liver, there are a couple of articles going into this. But in all of these sagas, a kind of an upstart Odin guy disrupts the sort of settled community of Frey worshippers and rises to a certain amount of power and then suffers a sudden reversal of fortune. A lot of people have read the story of Hrafnkel, Frey's Gothi. It's in the big compilation Penguin book. That's the one where Hrafnkel is a priest of Frey, and he swears that he'll kill anybody who rides this special horse. And of course, one of his guys rides the horse, and so he has to kill him. And this sets off a chain of events where he loses his Gothardy and has to go into a kind of an exile, but he builds up support, comes back, kicks out the upstart, who there are good reasons for thinking he's kind of Odinic in certain ways, and reestablishes his position. Then you have Gisli, I think it's Gisli the Outlaw, where at one point the sort of feud structure causes the hero to go in and stab his enemy, who's kind of a phrase man, with his spear while he's in bed with his wife, presumably doing, fertility-oriented things. And then he's buried in a mound that the snow doesn't fall on correctly, and Gisli is found out because he says a verse that kind of is a kind of a confession, but it's in riddles, so he doesn't expect anybody to hear it. And so there are a lot of similarities between these three sagas. And again, they all seem to have dropped a kind of a mythic or magical register, so that the supernatural elements are kind of sublimated behind the people and what they do. So as I've been thinking about the meaning of this, and especially Viga-Glum's downfall, and reading different interpretations, I see basically 2 or 3 major interpretations. I think the most mainstream one is the one that's given by, is it Tervi Petre or Terville Petre, in his some of his works. And the basic idea is that Viga-Glum, when he goes over to Norway and meets his grandfather and gets these items, he is basically initiated into an Odin cult. And he comes back protected by, first of all, Odin in the form of these 3 objects, and also the family luck in the form of the giant woman that he sees. And that as long as he has these during the period of his rise to power, Frey is basically unable to touch him because he's under the magic Odin umbrella that keeps Frey away. But that when Glúm makes this oath and he loses these objects, his supernatural shield or whatever that Odin has put on him disappears, and then Frey is able to take revenge. And this is probably the easiest interpretation to go to, that there's a kind of a taboo that Viga-Glum is not supposed to violate, and when he does, all of his luck goes away. And, there's a kind of a Chekhov's gun aspect to this, too. If you give a guy 3 magic objects in the beginning of the saga and say, bad things will happen to you when you get rid of these, he's going to get rid of them before the end of the saga. Just like Pandora's going to look in the box and Adam and Eve are going to eat the apple. But this is probably the easiest interpretation. And in many ways, it's really quite amenable to an aspect of heathen theology that's going on right now that I tend to call the sort of well and tree theology, or the symbol theology that many heathens have. And this all goes back to a book by Balshott's The Well and the Tree from the 80s, which is pretty difficult to get a copy of. But if you can interlibrary loan it or whatever, you ought to read it. And it is the idea that their oaths in particular, and especially oaths said in symbol, go into the well of weird and become part of a person's destiny. And this is the theology by which many people say that if you hail a malevolent entity like Loki, or you make a stupid oath that you can't fulfill, that it will go into the well and it will screw up the luck of everybody involved. I'm really pretty skeptical of this theory for a number of reasons. One of which is that if you read the sagas and the mythology, the heroes and protagonists, they don't go around being very cautious about who they give their oaths to, worried that it's going to blow up their luck and sink their life. No, they go around, they give all sorts of stupid oaths all the time, not really apparently thinking about it very much. But if you do want to find some kind of lore-based support for this idea that luck can be affected by poorly performed or ill-intentioned ritual, then this is the place to look for it, because Viga-Glum goes into Frey's temple, picks up the oath ring, and he doesn't exactly lie, but he gives his oath in such a way that it is extremely misleading and essentially false. And it's only after that that everything in his life blows up. The second interpretation is a kind of a, Shakespearean one, I suppose. And that is that Glúm fails as a chieftain because of some personal lack, that he has the Greek Tragic Flaw. That you could look at this as a kind of a 5-act Shakespearean tragedy where the hero is undone by his own mistakes or internal nature. And this is an interpretation that's put forward by Dubois in his book, Nordic Religion in the Viking Age. And he has almost a completely different take on Viga-Glum's saga. He doesn't think that it's very authentically pagan at all. He thinks that it's been extensively Christianized and that Viga-Glum is being presented as a figure of pride, which is, of course, the major Christian character failing in sin, and that this is supposed to be seen as an example of someone who has too much pride and goes too far. And I think there's something to that. It does seem like the same personality traits that lead to Glum's ascendancy over the district, his willingness to engage in violence and trickery, and his ruthlessness and his cleverness with words and law, all of those things that allow him to become a local leader are also the things that basically energize the opposition against him and cause him to be overthrown. So I think there's something to this. I'm not sure I buy the Christianity thing, but that's another plausible interpretation. But as I think about it, I look at both of those as both of those explanations as being almost kind of tactical or strategic second guessing of Viga-Glum. That if you read those, the moral of those stories is, this is where Glum screwed up. He should not have given a false oath. He shouldn't have given away his items. If he had not done that, everything would have been okay. Or you could say, Viga-Glum's problem is he didn't understand the limits of his own pride, and so he shouldn't have kept pushing and pushing. He should have moderated his own internal excesses. And there's something to that, but I think the stories like Viga-Glum's, there's something else going on too. It seems to me that the mistakes he makes, both political and supernatural, are in some ways only the proximate causes of his loss of political support. That in some ways he's following a kind of a trajectory that's laid out for him as an Odin's person. If you look at the different Odinic heroes in the sagas and the mythology, they almost always have bad stuff happen to them. If you were going to make a kind of a typology of it, the Odinic hero starts off from a disadvantaged situation. He uses his skill and his ability and his luck to rise rapidly and spectacularly and achieve great deeds. And then suddenly something happens to him and it all falls apart and he dies. And the collapse of the Odinsman is almost always caused by Odin. You can think about the king in, which one is it, Gottrik's Saga, who the ship that he's on with his followers is basically stuck somewhere, and they're going to make a sacrifice to Odin to help them out. And they draw lots for it, and even though he's basically rigged it, it comes up with his lot, and they do a kind of pretend sacrifice, and they put him in a kind of a weak, I forget what it is, a reed or something, or a wet rope that won't actually strangle him, and they poke him in the side with a reed instead of a spear. And yet, at the moment he does this, the rope turns real, strangles him, and the spear turns real and sticks him in the side. And the moral is, I guess, don't screw around with what Odin wants. And there's another king in, trying to remember all the names for these people, but there's a king who's riding his chariot in, I think, Rolf Saga Kraka, who is then, Odin reveals himself and causes him to die suddenly after being his patron. So, I mean, you can think about the Eric's Maul, where they ask, why does Eric get killed in this battle, even though he was obviously the more worthy opponent? And the answer is that the gray wolf is always gazing at the dwelling of the gods, and that Odin took Eric in order to have him become one of his warriors. So there's also a sense in which the Odinic hero or the Odinic person following this trajectory ends in a kind of a sacrifice. it doesn't happen in all of these sagas because they talk about actual human beings and, you know, things happen to them in their lives that don't quite fit this pattern. But it does seem to me that that's there, that implicit in being an Odin's person is you have a kind of a bargain. And like Faust, I guess, there's a payout for a while and then there's a price. And often the price is betrayal and or possibly resurrection afterwards. If you think about the Einherjar or Balder or whatever, these are heroes who rise to greatness, collapse, and then in one way or another are resurrected. If you get more towards the kind of the mythical end of the scale. And I think that's probably how Viga-Glum should be seen. That he's not just making tactical errors, and he's not just acting out perfectly ordinary human traits, but that the very things that make him a kind of an Odin's person are also the things that destroy him, and the sudden reversal of fortune is really part of the whole package deal. So, I don't know, what does that mean in terms of implications for us today? I guess, first of all, if you're looking for a leader, the Odinic leader may not necessarily be the ideal person today, that they tend to bring with themselves self-destruction and tend to have pretty sharp elbows. Now, I don't mean to say that somebody who's, you know, close to Odin should not necessarily lead a kindred or whatever. But a lot of people think of Odin as being a kind of a king who establishes order, and therefore the ideal model for a leader would be a kind of imitatio Odini of someone basically replicating his functions as king and sovereign. And I have a lot of problem with that. And you can look to the counterexample of Frey, who is a patron of kings as well. But he's a kind of a patron of a fruitful, peaceful community, or at least not riven by internal divisions in the same way Odin is. I guess second of all would be a warning to all those Odin people, including myself, that it's not necessarily going to end well. That the essential mythic pattern of being an Odin's person is that eventually Odin is going to turn around and betray you. It's not necessarily, you know, a real betrayal if it's what you signed up for, but it'll certainly feel like a real betrayal. And there may be some form of Balder-esque or Einherjar-ish resurrection after this destruction. But a sudden reversal of fortune in which the Odin dedicee becomes, in some ways, the Odinic sacrifice is definitely part of the part of what you're signing up for. And I guess, to go back to my sort of fetish about bow shots and the sort of luck theology that we use in Ensemble, it seems to me that the moral here is not that someone should be very cautious about their oaths and their luck and their ritual practice so that they can avoid a fate like Viga-Glum's, that Viga-Glum essentially made a technical screw-up in his performance of ritual. I think that he probably was led to screw up the ritual by the same combination of natural and supernatural factors that worked in his rise. That there's no way you can fly the Odinic airplane safely sometimes. And that kind of, grimly enough, sums up my thoughts on Viga-Glum's saga. So let me pause the slideshow here, or stop the slideshow, and we'll go over to questions or thoughts or whatever.
And everyone remember that your mic is muted, so if you have a question, you need to unmute yourself. Tom, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the eventual fate of the Odinsman. I know this isn't necessarily what you were prepared to talk about, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on why why is it that so many people seem drawn to swearing to Odin, and it's seemingly without ever thinking about that? Or maybe, because that does seem to be a recurring theme across not just this saga, but many of the sagas. It seems like, or many of the stories, you see frequently Odinsman getting hurt in some way, usually mortally.
Well, I don't know. It was something I was very conscious of when I signed up to it, for it, I guess. And I still have not suffered my Odinic reversal of fortune that destroys me, and hopefully I never will. But Odin is also the god of, what do you want to say, poetry and ecstasy, and there are a lot of really good things about being with Odin that are sort of the flip side of the same tendencies. And at a certain point, you know, we all die. And awful things happen to us pretty often in the course of a human lifetime anyway. It's, in some ways, it's better to have a patron and to have a death that serves a larger purpose, and to know that somebody's paying attention and cares, even if it involves dying. I think the resurrection part of it, or resurrection's too Christian a word, but the return to life is also associated with Odin. You know, he hangs himself, and then he gets up and walks around. And the chosen heroes, the Einherjar, come back to life in his hall. And I take that as being sort of examples of a larger part of the same pattern.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Or maybe I was just really freaking lonely. I don't know.
or yeah, yeah. Anyone else have any questions about where we're at so far?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for such a great recap of the whole story, and I will like to go through and actually reread it. Hopefully, maybe one of the newer translations will have it arranged a little bit better to help keep me engaged. One of the things I found difficult about this one was just not knowing when one person was speaking to the other until you get halfway through the sentence. So it just kind of made me go back and forth a lot, trying to, okay, what? Who's saying this now? And things like that. So that's one of the technical aspects of why. But I did make it through half of it before I was like, oh, wow, this is crazy. But I love the way that you tell the story, and I'm really interested in actually getting to the end to be reading about the oath part of it, which I, just glancing through my pages, looks like it's about chapter 25. So, and
yeah, every time I read the saga, I go and I find the Icelandic or the Old Norse, and I figure out exactly what it's doing grammatically, and I read some commentary that explains how it works grammatically, and then 5 minutes later I forget how it works and I can't tell you.
But I love.
It was really, really hard for me to follow the punctuation in the version that I had, which was one of the 1800s translations. That
yeah, it's not the best translation, but it's free, and for a web chat, you know, it's good enough.
No, it's great. No, I appreciate that. And then I really just like how you explained the trajectory of the character, and it's just so common for the folks that the heroes and the folks that we are not heroes, but just how people do things. You know, how they rise to power. They have maybe good intentions at first, and then all of a sudden they get a little started in it, and then it just kind of goes to their head, and then they end up downfalling. So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of good lessons in there.
Yeah, I made a bunch of liberal friends of mine annoyed when I pointed out that Trump is a very Odinic figure.
I was thinking that a lot, yes.
I mean, he hasn't reached the self-destruction stage yet, but you can see how it might happen.
Uh-huh, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and if that author is actually French, it would be Trevi-Pet.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. I think was he Belgian or something? I can't remember what his native language is or was.
If it's Belgian, then it would still be the same, Trevi-Pet. So they speak French there.
Yeah.
I have a technical question
Yeah.
regarding just the sagas in general. Is there a place somewhere that one can find maps of Iceland at that time?
At that time, not so much, but you can look up where all the major fjords are. I mean, they built everything out of wood. There's pretty much nothing left from the Saga age now. But the place names are basically the same, and some of the farms are in continuous operation. So if you plug it into your Google, you'll probably find it. And many of the Penguin editions, I think they're the best English editions of these. They usually have a good commentary and notes and a map. The
ones that I have penguins of
$20 and get the real thing and not deal with ancient internet translations that are like only 1 year younger than the Abraham Lincoln assassination.
Yeah.
And Icelandic geography is pretty easy too. It's basically a donut. The center of the place is a giant, horrible glacier desert, and the outer parts are kind of a crinkly indentation where they can have farms in different fjords. So it's really just a question of which little crinkly indentations you're on.
Yeah, I've got the Penguin edition of other sagas, so I'm familiar with that phenomenon on others. It's just that I don't have the Penguin on this one, so yeah. I was trying to figure it out without it. So
the sagas are definitely you have to learn how to read them and get used to them, and the first couple times through are kind of tricky. I don't know. Any other deep thoughts about things? Superficial thoughts about things?
Well,
was the conflict?
Go ahead.
Was the apparent conflict between the Odinic and Freyc model a common thing? You mentioned that the Odinic heroes were a common theme, and I mean that only makes sense because speaking as someone who is closer to a Frey, we're not as exciting.
Yeah.
It's just not the way we're made. But so you're not going to have stories about us as much.
Yeah.
But is this something that was more of a typical thing, or is it just that there were stories that's what the stories happen to be about, or or is that even something that we can even tell at this point because it's so far out and because the history is so obscured at this point?
Well, the conventional wisdom on this, if you look at people who look at the sagas and Norse religion and stuff, is that there's a lot of stuff written about Odin because Odin is the patron of basically the sort of the warrior chieftain, who are the guys paying for the poems, essentially, and the god of poets, of skaldic poetry, which is one of the major sources of information, and to a kind of an extent, gods of writing sort of in general. So most of the stories are kind of about Odin people, probably by Odin people, because they occupy a particular segment of the society that intersects with poetry and kingship, and I guess a little bit later on, with Saga writing, although by that point they were all Christian. But if you look at somebody like Snorri Sturluson, and you got him alone, and you got him to whisper who his favorite god really was, I'm pretty sure he'd say Odin. He'd probably still be a Christian, but if he had to pick one, he's definitely got some Odinic tendencies. So that's part of it. Another part of it is locational. Frey was really the most popular, it seems, in Sweden, where he was the patron of essentially the kings of Sweden. And Odin seems to have been an aristocratic god for Norway. I'm not sure about Denmark, of a kind of a different kind of chieftain. And the ordinary people tended to be more oriented towards Thor. So most people say there probably wasn't much of an Odin cult in Iceland, that many of the people who went over there were probably Thor people. I don't know how that explains all these sagas being about Frey. But they're two very different models of kingship, and so they come into conflict. If you're looking for Frey stuff, they're the three sagas I mentioned. Let's see, there was a monograph I read not too long ago about Frey as a sacral king out of a press. I think it was in Sweden or Finland, but was in English. You can probably find. And the Frey and Freya stuff, there's a lot of stuff involving animals. Remember the poem in the Edda where Freya is basically riding this boar that seems to be one of her heroes. The information about it is too fragmentary to really quite tell what's going on. And sacred animals show up a lot. There's the bull in this story. There's the horse in the Hrafnkel Frey's Gothi story. So those are all different avenues you could try tracking down more Frey material. And of course the Linga Saga in the Heimskringla, basically the first big semi-mythical saga about the gods and so forth. He shows up in there a lot.
Thank you.
Tom, for those of us that are just starting to read the sagas as opposed to the first year lore, like myself, what are some of the ones that you think are easiest to read to get started getting used to the cadence or the style, if you will, of the sagas? Because I'll be honest, I've read a couple and I'm generally not a huge fan of the sagas. I hate to say it. It makes me a bad heathen, but I don't particularly enjoy reading the sagas. So,
well, they can be.
I'm not alone.
They can be difficult and kind of boring, especially when it's just Thorstein A killing Thorstein B in these convoluted pretzels of feud.
And the patronymics get confusing.
Oh yeah. Many good editions will have like a chart in the back that shows how they're related to each other. But as far as starting goes, I would recommend starting with, of the classic sagas, I'd start with Egil's Saga, because it has so much that's sort of relevant to our interests and is not too focused on, sort of proto-Christianity interpretations. And also Egil is a very interesting saga character, an awful lot like Viga-Glum, so it's fun to watch what he does. The other recommended starting saga for most of these kinds of courses is Njal Saga, Burnt Njal Saga. And that's also a very good saga, but it seems to have, it has a structure where Njal is this saintly, peaceable guy who gets drawn into feud sort of despite his best efforts, and eventually he and his family get killed in a kind of, I don't know, almost a kind of proto-Christian martyrdom. And it's so, I would think that was a little bit less congenial to people who are interested in the Viking Age more than the conversion period, because there definitely seems to be a kind of a heavy-handed, backwards projected sort of thinking about Christian values. Although it's also very interesting, and it shows a lot of the limits of a society built on feuding as a form of law enforcement. The other one you might want to look at that's also good for people who are sort of beginners is Grettir's Saga. The Saga of Grettir the Strong. And this is a guy, he gets outlawed, and he ends up wandering around Iceland and meeting various trolls and things, and Draugr, and he gets cursed by like this one uber zombie that's living in the mound that he fights. And he eventually dies too, but there's all sorts of interesting little supernatural bits in it that I think are kind of cool. And so it might be a little bit more lively than some of the others. Those are the ones I'd start with. If you want short stuff, Hrafnkel's Frey's Gothi is very interesting. The Eric the Red Saga is kind of interesting because it talks about the expeditions to North America, and also has an awful lot about Sather in it. So that one's kind of interesting, and it's pretty short.
That's actually one of the ones that I've read because of the Sather parts to it.
But some of it, you just kind of have to relax and go into Zen mode and let the names wash over you until you find another point for you to latch onto.
Right, of interest, something you actually care about reading. Okay. Well, does anybody else have any questions before I stop the recording? That doesn't mean that we have to leave the room. Just just gonna stop the recording unless there's something else that pertains to this. John, if you're talking, you're muted.
Yeah,
I was unmuting myself. So, Tom, in the lore program, where would this best fit, this saga, as we're going through the lore program? Do you have a recommendation?
I don't think it is one of the ones that we read for the lore program, which is
okay.
But it's probably because it's harder to find a translation of it, and it's a second tier saga, but it's got interesting things in it.
Yeah, it does. Have you read?
Right now, we read the sagas in year 2.
Okay.
And most of them are in a big penguin compilation, if you've seen that one. The Sagas of the Icelanders. It's got like 5 or 6 big sagas and a couple of little ones. And it's a kind of a, I don't know, Whitman's sampler of the sagas. And we read that, and then a couple of others. Oh, yeah.
I'm totally going to quote you on Whitman's sampler of the sagas. That's awesome.
People often read Eyrbyggja's saga a lot because it describes a pagan temple and stuff about land spirits and things near the beginning.
Okay.
And it has the most glorious euphemism of all time, which is when people go to the bathroom, it's called doing their elf frighteners.
Doing their elf what?
Doing their elf frighteners. And this one settler, supposedly, he goes and he makes this district and he builds a temple to it. And he says it's so holy that nobody is allowed to go to the bathroom on the land. They have to go out to this thing and use the bathroom there. And it's an enormous inconvenience. And so one day while this other family is visiting, they're just like, screw you. And they all go out and like pee or crap or whatever it is. It's supposed to be euphemized there. Like right where they're not supposed to, defiling the land and angering the elves. And that makes the two families like go to war with each other.
Wow. Wow.
No kidding.
So I'm going to stop this, but the recording.
Oh, yeah, I can put in a plug for my book, too. I've got a novel.
Your book, and then I'll stop the recording. Go ahead.
Got a novel up on Amazon. Let's see here. Oh, it's not showing it. Anyway, I got a novel up on Amazon called The Devourer of the Gods, which is kind of Viking-esque. You can check that out.
Okay.
That was the book I was working on when I went to Iceland and found Viga-Glum Saga.
Oh, okay.
Lovely. Okay, I'm stopping
that. If you want Odin to pay attention to you, you can write a book about him.
Huh.